Most people don't realize this, but they begin to lose respect in the exact moment they start explaining themselves too much. It doesn't happen loudly, and it's rarely obvious, but something subtle shifts in the way they speak, in the way they carry themselves, and more importantly, in the way others begin to perceive them. You've probably felt it before. You're in the middle of a conversation, and at some point, you catch yourself going further than you needed to, adding more detail, more context, more clarification. Not because you're unclear, but because you want to make sure you're understood. And yet, the more you talk, the more something feels off. Not in your logic, not in your reasoning, but in the energy behind your words. Because without realizing it, you've shifted from expressing certainty to seeking agreement. And people can sense that instantly. The more you explain yourself, the less powerful you appear. Not because you're wrong, but because every extra word begins to signal hesitation, and hesitation quietly erodes authority. This is where Stoicism draws a clear line. Because real power was never about being understood by everyone in the room. It was about standing firm in who you are, without feeling the need to justify it. And there are certain things, 7 to be exact, that the moment you start explaining them, you begin to give that power away. Reframe. Silence is a form of control. There's a moment you've already experienced, maybe more than once, when you realized you were saying too much, trying too hard to be understood, and slowly feeling your position weaken as the conversation went on. That moment wasn't about your words being wrong. It was about something deeper shifting beneath them. Silence is not what made you uncomfortable. Losing control is. Most people have been conditioned to believe that clarity comes from speaking more. If something feels off, they add explanations. If they feel misunderstood, they push harder. But the more they try to fix the situation with words, the more they give away something they don't even realize they're trading. Authority, because every extra sentence, when driven by the need to be accepted, signals something subtle. Not weakness in intelligence, but uncertainty in position. And people don't consciously analyze this. They feel it. The moment you start explaining too much, you are no longer leading the interaction, you are negotiating your place in it. This is where the Stoic perspective changes everything. Silence is not the absence of communication. It is the discipline of choosing when communication is necessary. It is the ability to stay grounded in your position, even when the environment pushes you to react. And that requires something most people avoid, sitting with discomfort without immediately trying to escape it. When you don't rush to fill the silence, you create space. Space to observe, to think, and most importantly, to remain centered. You stop chasing understanding, and instead, you let your presence speak for you. Power is not in how well you explain yourself. It is in how little you need to. This doesn't mean becoming distant or cold. It means becoming selective. It means recognizing that not every moment deserves your explanation, and not every person deserves your clarity. Over time, something shifts. You stop speaking to prove yourself. You stop reacting to be accepted. And without forcing it, you begin to carry something others can sense immediately: certainty. And certainty, unlike words, doesn't need to be explained. Why explaining weakens you? Psychology breakdown. You don't lose power because you speak. You lose power because of why you speak. Explaining too much is rarely about clarity. It's about approval. When you feel the need to explain yourself excessively, something subtle is happening beneath the surface. Your mind is trying to reduce discomfort. It wants to be understood, validated, and accepted. So it pushes you to add more context, more reasons, more justification, hoping that somewhere in those extra words, the other person will finally agree. But psychologically, this creates the opposite effect. The more you try to convince, the more you position the other person as the judge. Now the dynamic has shifted. You are no longer speaking from certainty. You are waiting for a verdict. And people can feel that shift instantly, not logically, but emotionally. Because confidence has a certain stillness to it, while approval seeking has movement, tension, and urgency. There's also another layer most people overlook. When you over-explain, you signal that your position is flexible under pressure, that if questioned enough, you will adjust, clarify, or even retreat. And this trains others, subconsciously, to push further, doubt more, and respect less. Every unnecessary explanation is a small negotiation of your own authority. This is why those who carry real presence often say less. Not because they have less to offer, but because they don't feel the need to prove it. Their certainty is not built through words. It's reflected in their restraint. And once you understand this, something becomes clear. Power is not in having the perfect explanation. It's in not needing one at all. Rule 1. Never explain your goals. There's a quiet moment that happens more often than you realize. Someone asks what you're working toward, and without thinking too much, you begin to explain. You talk about your plans, your vision, the direction you're trying to take your life. At first, it feels natural. It feels like you're simply sharing clarity. But if you pay attention, something subtle begins to shift. The more you explain your goals, the less grounded they start to feel. Not because your vision lacks value, but because you've moved it from something internal and controlled to something exposed and open to interpretation. Once spoken out loud, your goals are no longer just yours. They enter a space where other people can question them, misunderstand them, or measure them against their own limitations. And that changes the energy behind them. Most people think sharing goals creates accountability, but more often it creates dependency. You begin to notice how others react. You look for signs of approval, even unconsciously. And when that approval isn't there, it introduces doubt, not always loudly, but just enough to disrupt your focus. When your goals need to be understood by others, they stop being anchored within you. From a Stoic perspective, this is where discipline becomes essential. Your goals are not something to be explained. They are something to be executed. They don't require an audience to exist, and they don't become more real because someone else acknowledges them. In fact, the opposite is often true. When you speak too early, you release the tension that should have been directed into action. You feel a temporary sense of progress just by talking about it, and that illusion can quietly replace the actual work required to move forward. Talking about your goals can feel like movement, but it is not the same as progress. There's also a deeper layer most people ignore. Not everyone you speak to is aligned with your direction. Some will project their own fears. Others will offer advice based on limitations you've already outgrown. Even when they mean well, their perspective can dilute your clarity. This is why silence becomes protection, not secrecy. When you move without explaining every step, you stay closer to your intention. You build momentum without interference. You allow your actions to shape your identity instead of your words trying to define it prematurely. Over time, something changes within you. You stop feeling the need to talk about what you're building. You stop looking for reactions. You stop adjusting your vision to make it more acceptable. And instead, you focus on one thing: execution. Let your actions carry the weight your words never could. Because real goals are not proven through explanation. They are revealed through results. Rule 2. Never explain your decisions. There comes a moment after you make a decision, especially one that others don't fully understand, when the pressure begins to build. Someone asks why, and almost immediately you feel the urge to explain, to walk them through your reasoning, to justify your choice, to make it make sense in a way they can accept. At first, it seems harmless, even responsible. But something subtle begins to shift the moment you step into that explanation. The more you justify your decisions, the less certain you appear. Not because your thinking is flawed, but because explanation, when driven by the need for agreement, changes your position. You are no longer standing firmly behind your choice. You are presenting it, almost like a case, waiting for it to be approved. And once you do that, the dynamic changes. You stop owning your decision and start defending it. Psychologically, this matters more than most people realize. When you explain too much, you signal that your decision is open to evaluation, that it can be questioned, challenged, or even reshaped depending on the response you receive. And while you may not intend this, others feel it immediately. Confidence has a certain stillness. It doesn't rush to convince. But over-explaining introduces movement, extra words, added layers, unnecessary detail, and that movement creates doubt where there was once clarity. When you feel the need to convince others, you quietly convince yourself that their approval matters. From a Stoic perspective, this is where discipline becomes internal. You cannot control whether others agree with your choices. You cannot control how they interpret your path, but you can control whether you remain anchored in your own judgment or allow external opinions to pull you away from it. A decision, once made with clarity, does not need to be explained to everyone. It may need to be communicated, yes, but not justified. There is a difference. Communication is simple and direct. It states what is. Justification, on the other hand, tries to reduce resistance. And the moment you begin trying to reduce resistance, you give it power over you. Strong decisions don't argue, they stand. This doesn't mean you ignore feedback or become rigid. It means you recognize when a conversation is about understanding and when it is about seeking validation. Most people blur that line without realizing it, and in doing so, they weaken their own authority. Over time, this habit compounds. You start second-guessing choices that were once clear. You begin adjusting your direction based on reactions, not conviction, and slowly, you move further away from your own center. But when you stop explaining every decision, something changes. You become more grounded, more decisive, more self-directed, because true confidence isn't proven through explanation. It is revealed through consistency. The shift you can't unsee. There's a point in every interaction where something invisible decides how you are perceived. It's not your logic. It's not how detailed your explanation is. It's something far simpler and far more powerful. People don't respect explanations. They respect certainty. You can say all the right things, give all the right reasons, and still lose presence in the room because respect is not built through how much you explain, but through how firmly you stand. And certainty has a very different energy. It doesn't rush. It doesn't overextend. It doesn't need to prove itself in real time. Pause. Because once you see this, you can't unsee it. Every time you feel the urge to explain more, to add just one more reason, to make it clearer, what you're really doing is stepping away from that certainty. And certainty is silent. Rule 3. Never explain your boundaries. There's a moment that feels small, almost invisible, but it changes everything. You say no, and then immediately feel the need to explain why. You add context. You soften your tone. You try to make it easier for the other person to accept, and without realizing it, you've already weakened your position. The moment you start explaining your boundaries, you invite negotiation, not because people are intentionally trying to cross you, but because explanation signals flexibility. It suggests that your boundary is open to discussion, that it can be adjusted if the right argument is made, or if enough pressure is applied. And most people, consciously or not, respond to that signal. They push a little further. They ask again. They look for a way around what you just said. This is where many people get stuck. They believe that being kind means being accommodating, that setting a boundary requires making the other person feel comfortable with it. So they explain more, hoping to reduce tension. But tension is not the problem. The need to remove tension is. From a Stoic perspective, boundaries are not about controlling others. They are about defining yourself. They are a reflection of what you allow, what you value, and what you refuse to compromise on. And anything that defines you should not need constant justification. When you explain your boundaries too much, you shift from clarity to persuasion. You stop stating what is and start trying to make it acceptable. And in doing so, you give away authority that should have remained with you. A boundary is strongest when it is simple. I'm not available. I'm not comfortable with that. That doesn't work for me. No long explanation. No apology hidden inside extra words. Just clarity. This doesn't make you cold. It makes you grounded. Because people don't respect boundaries that are explained repeatedly. They respect boundaries that are consistent, calm, and unwavering over time. And yes, at first, it may feel uncomfortable. You may feel like you're being too harsh. You may feel the urge to go back and clarify, to soften what you said. But that discomfort is not a sign that you're wrong. It's a sign that you're no longer abandoning yourself to make others comfortable. Over time, something changes. You stop over-explaining. You stop negotiating your limits. You stop needing others to agree with your standards. And in that space, a new kind of confidence begins to form, because when your boundaries no longer need explanation, they become part of your identity. Rule 4. Never explain your personal life. There's a quiet pressure in everyday conversations that most people don't question. Someone asks about your relationship, your struggles, your family, or what you're going through, and without thinking too much, you start explaining. You fill in the details, clarify the situation, and try to make your life understandable from the outside. At first, it feels like connection, like honesty, but something deeper is happening underneath. The more you explain your personal life, the more you give away control over how it's perceived. Not everyone is asking because they truly want to understand. Some are curious. Some are comparing, some are simply filling space, and when you respond with full transparency, you hand over pieces of your life to people who haven't earned the responsibility of holding them. From a Stoic perspective, this is where awareness matters. Your personal life is not public property. It is not something that needs to be clarified for everyone who asks. It is something to be protected. Privacy is not secrecy. It is self-respect. When you feel the need to explain everything, it often comes from a subtle desire to be seen accurately, to make sure others don't misunderstand you. But the truth is, people will interpret your life through their own lens, no matter how clearly you explain it. And once your story is out there, you no longer control how it's used. They may simplify it, they may judge it, they may repeat it, not always with bad intentions, but rarely with full understanding. This is why restraint becomes power. When you choose not to explain every detail, you create a boundary between your inner world and the outside noise. You stop managing how others see you and start focusing on how you live. Not everything that is true about you needs to be shared. There's also a shift that happens internally. When you stop explaining your personal life, you stop looking outward for validation of your experiences. You begin to process things on your own terms without needing someone else to confirm that what you're going through makes sense. And that builds a different kind of strength. You become more centered, more private, more self-directed. This doesn't mean you isolate yourself or avoid connection. It means you become selective. You choose carefully who has access to your life instead of offering it freely. Over time, this changes how others relate to you. There is less room for judgment, less space for interference, less opportunity for misunderstanding, and in that space, something grows. The less you explain your personal life, the more it remains yours. Rule 5. Never explain your past. There's a quiet urge many people carry. The need to explain where they come from, what they've been through, and why they are the way they are. When someone misunderstands you, it feels natural to reach back into your past and bring forward a story that makes everything make sense. You try to connect the dots for them. You try to give context. You try to be understood. But something subtle happens the moment you do. The more you explain your past, the more you allow it to define you. Not because your past is insignificant, but because once it is spoken, it becomes a lens others begin to use. They stop seeing who you are now and start interpreting you through what you've told them. And even if your intention was clarity, The result is often limitation. From a Stoic perspective, this is where awareness becomes crucial. Your past is real, but it is not your identity. It is something you experienced, not something you are required to defend. You don't owe anyone the full story of how you became yourself. When you explain your past too much, it often comes from a desire to be seen fairly, to make sure others don't misjudge you. But the truth is, people will still interpret you through their own beliefs, no matter how carefully you explain. And once your past is out there, you no longer control how it's framed. They may reduce it, they may misunderstand it, they may attach it to you in ways you never intended. Even when people listen, they rarely carry the full weight of your experience. They hear fragments, not depth. And those fragments can quietly shape how they treat you. This is why restraint matters. When you don't rush to explain your past, you allow your present actions to speak louder than your history. You give people the opportunity to see who you are now, without anchoring them to who you once were. Your past is context, not a justification. There's also something that changes internally. When you stop explaining your past, you stop revisiting it for validation. You begin to move forward without needing to constantly reference where you started. And that creates a sense of freedom, because you are no longer tied to a narrative you feel responsible to explain. This doesn't mean denying your past or hiding it. It means choosing when and with whom it is worth sharing. It means recognizing that not every moment requires a backstory. Over time, this creates a different kind of presence. You are not anchored in explanation. You are not shaped by old labels. You are not pulled backward to be understood. Instead, you stand in who you are now, because the less you explain your past, the more space you create to redefine yourself. Rule 6. Never explain your value. There's a quiet pressure many people feel, especially in moments where they sense they're being overlooked or underestimated. You start to feel the need to prove something, to show your worth, to explain your effort, to make others recognize what you bring to the table. So you begin listing what you've done. You highlight your achievements. You try to make your value visible through words. At first, it feels reasonable. But something subtle begins to shift. The moment you start explaining your value, you place it in someone else's hands. Not because your value disappears, but because you've turned it into something that needs to be evaluated. Instead of being self-evident, it becomes something to be judged, questioned, or even dismissed, depending on the perspective of the person listening. And that changes everything. From a psychological standpoint, over-explaining your worth often comes from a need for recognition. You want to be seen clearly, fairly, accurately. But the more you try to control how others see you, the more you depend on their response to feel secure. When your value needs validation, it stops feeling like value and starts feeling like negotiation. People rarely respect what is constantly explained, not because they disagree, but because true value has a different presence. It is felt in consistency, in behavior, in how you carry yourself, not in how often you speak about it. From a Stoic perspective, your value is not something you perform, it is something you live. It is expressed in your standards, in your discipline, in the way you respond under pressure. And none of those require explanation. Value is not declared, it is demonstrated. There's also a deeper risk most people overlook. When you explain your worth too often, you begin to tie your identity to how well you can defend it. You start measuring yourself through reactions, through acknowledgement, through external signals that were never meant to define you. Over time, this creates instability. You feel confident when others agree. You feel uncertain when they don't. And slowly, your sense of self becomes dependent on something outside your control. But when you stop explaining your value, something shifts. You stop trying to be seen. You start focusing on being consistent. You let your actions speak without needing reinforcement. And that creates a different kind of presence, one that doesn't fluctuate based on opinion. because the strongest value is the one that doesn't need to be proven. Rule 7. Never explain your silence. There's a moment that almost everyone has experienced. You choose not to speak. You stay quiet in a conversation, or you don't respond immediately, or you simply observe instead of reacting, and then it comes. Why are you so quiet? Is something wrong? Say something. In that moment, you feel the pressure, the urge to explain, to reassure, to fill the space so others feel comfortable again. And without realizing it, you're about to give up one of the most powerful forms of control you have. The moment you explain your silence, you turn it into something that needs permission. Silence is often misunderstood because it disrupts expectations. Most people are used to constant noise, constant responses, constant reactions, constant validation. So when you don't participate in that rhythm, it creates uncertainty. And people try to resolve that uncertainty by pulling you back into it. But your silence was never a problem to begin with. It was a choice. Silence is not the absence of something, it is the presence of control. From a Stoic perspective, silence is discipline in its purest form. It is the ability to hold your position without reacting to every stimulus. It is the strength to observe without immediately engaging, to listen without needing to respond, and to remain grounded when others are driven by impulse. When you explain your silence, you break that discipline. You shift from being intentional to being reactive. You go from choosing not to speak to justifying why you didn't. And that changes how others perceive you. Because people don't question noise, they question what they don't understand. And when you rush to explain your silence, you signal that their discomfort matters more than your choice. Silence loses its power the moment it is defended. There's also something deeper happening internally. When you allow yourself to stay silent without explanation, you become more comfortable with stillness. You no longer feel the need to fill every gap, to respond to every comment, or to prove your presence through words. You begin to realize that your value is not tied to how much you speak. It is reflected in when you choose to. Over time, this creates a different kind of presence. You become harder to read, but easier to respect. You speak less, but when you do, it carries weight. You react less, but you influence more. And most importantly, you stop seeking permission to exist the way you are. Because silence, when chosen, is not weakness, it is authority without noise. At some point, this stops being about communication and starts becoming about identity. You begin to notice it in small moments, when you feel the urge to explain, to add more, to make yourself easier to accept. And then you choose not to. Not out of resistance, but out of clarity. You realize that most explanations were never about truth. They were about comfort, approval, or control you didn't actually need. The shift happens when you no longer speak to be understood, but act from who you are. Personally, this is where everything changes. Not overnight, but through repetition. You start catching yourself mid-sentence, pulling back, choosing simplicity over justification. And at first, it feels unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. But that discomfort is the space where self-respect begins to grow. A simple practice. Pause before you explain. Ask yourself, am I adding clarity or seeking approval? If it's approval, stop there. Another, say less, but mean it fully. Let silence carry part of your message. Over time, your presence becomes clearer because it is no longer diluted by the need to be accepted. And when that happens, something becomes undeniable. You are no longer reacting to the world. You are defining how you exist within it.